So it's lesson 3, part 2 of our server-side scripting class. You guys made it back just in time. You're all fed and watered. All right, don't spill anything on your laptops after all that. So we've got looked at how to kind of mock up some data. We looked at how to pass data from one page to another. We're going to kind of maybe modify this a bit. I'll maybe leave this section here, but we're going to look at another way of, we've kind of hard-coded the data in here. What I'm going to do instead now is maybe we'll mock up some data, but we'll mock it up in the controller. We'll mock up a list and pass it this way. So to do this, we're eventually, next week, we're going to connect up to our database and generate models from our database. But what we're going to do today is maybe just mock up a model for starters. So we're going to go to models and let's add a new item. Actually, we can just pick right here from the bottom. We can just add a class. So we're going to create a model class. So we'll just pick class, and we'll call our class album. We're probably going to blow this away next week. We're just mocking it up for today. Okay. So create an album.cs. And this is going to look very similar to the kind of classes you will have created in your intro to OO with Java. Right? We've got a class definition called album. So let's just set up a couple of properties here. Actually, for now, we can even just get away probably with one property. So we'll make an album class. Right now, it only has one property. We'll have some other properties when we work with our database hosts. We're going to want things like artist, price. We'll have an album cover, so we can have an image inside an album. But this will be good enough for now. We just need an object. We're going to look at how these objects work in relation with our controllers and our views. Actually, we'll leave this page alone. We'll leave this view alone as it is. We'll create another method, and it'll load another view. And in here, we'll mock up some data, but that data will be of type album. Right? We're going to pass in, rather than just using the ViewBag, which is just kind of a generic container, we're going to actually pass in a strongly typed list of album objects, which we're going to mock up. We will return a view. And we won't generate the view yet. And we'll do this two ways. First, I actually will use the ViewBag, just so we can see how it behaves differently than if we actually pass in a list of strongly typed objects. No, actually, we don't need to do that. We'll use our model. So we're going to use this album, and we'll maybe just in a loop generate a list of kind of 10 fake albums. Now, notice if I try and make reference to the album class in my controller, it doesn't come up in my list. Visual Studio doesn't know what that album model is, or that album class. So here's our class. Notice it's part of the models namespace because it's in the models folder. our controller doesn't know what this is. So in order to do this, whenever we've built files so far, Visual Studio adds a bunch of references. So notice at the top of our controller file, we've got one reference in black and 3 in gray. Sorry, 4 in gray. These means these references have been added, but they're not being used. In order for any controller to be able to access any model class, our controller is going to have to make a reference to our model's namespace. Otherwise, those classes are not visible. So if we make a reference to our solution name, our project name.models, now notice Visual Studio knows what an album object is. Sure. So we have a using statement, our project name, and then the namespace name. So this will mean any classes we create in our model are now available inside the controller's namespace. But they're in different namespaces because all our code is modular. We can move it in and out, move it among projects. Right? The models are not dependent on the controllers. But the controllers are dependent on our models. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a list, basically create an array. Here's how we do it in C#. We're going to make a list of strongly typed objects. Our list is empty. We're instantiating an empty list of album objects. Whoops. Sorry. We're calling the constructor, but we're specifying what type of object. So we can't put strings or dates or artists or anything else in this list. Every item in this list has to be of this type. So it will have any properties, methods, events of an album. So eventually, if we actually look at what this looks like when we're scaffolding, and if we want to get a list here, eventually we'll do this. We'll take our list of industries from the database and call it to a list. We're not using the database today, so we're going to mock this up. We'll do a simple loop, 1 to 10. Oops. So we'll declare just a simple counter called I. We'll loop around 10 times, and each time we go around our loop, we're going to create a new album and add it to our list. And then we'll pass that whole list of album objects to our view, so we can render it. Any list in the .NET framework has an add method has a remove method. So we're going to add a new album. Whoops. Notice also our properties are case sensitive. So it doesn't like my title, lowercase, but Visual Studio suggests a fix. My fix should be. Hang on just a second. What do we call it? Title. meant to make this public. Yes, my apologies. I had to go back to my model. My title property was not visible in my other file until I made it public. So any of those properties should be declared as public if we want to reference them from somewhere else. So in my models album, my title is public. So this should create a list with 10 albums, album 1 through 10. So when our loop is done, we're going to have this object called albums. Now this is kind of a weird quirk about .NET programming. I've got a strongly typed list, but notice it's actually declared with the keyword var, which we used to do for a long time, and then for many years programmers were told don't use var, actually declare the data type on your variables. Although var nowadays means something different than it meant 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, var meant this list is basically untyped. It can have any data type and it's fluid. var doesn't mean this list is untyped now. Why? What do you suppose happens when I declare this list with var? Sorry? It's more than an object. It is still strongly typed. Basically, the .NET compiler is going to infer what type of objects they are, because I've already said it's a list of type album. So it therefore knows that that's what kind of object I have in here. It can infer the properties and methods because I've declared it this way. So I'm not crazy about this coding style. I tried not to use it, but I found it's unavoidable because all the code samples and documentation you see nowadays for modern .NET programming will use var for our lists. I don't love it because I was trained for a long time not to do this. But that school of thought's kind of lost out. So last thing we need to do is now when we load our view, we also need, we're not going to use the ViewBag, we also need to pass it this strongly typed list. So in here, when we return our view, we've been using mostly this first overload, so don't pass anything. We've tried this method where we specified a different name. That works. We now want to use the third overload, where we're actually passing in a strongly typed object. So it could be a single object. In this case, we want to pass in a list of objects. So we'll pass in our list. We may need to do one more thing to tweak it. We'll see how it runs. So eventually, we don't want to do this. We don't want this. We don't want to use an array to create our data. The data is actually going to live in the database, and we'll pull it out of the database starting next week. We want to look at what happens in the view when that view is being given a bunch of data. Again, most of this stuff's going to get automated later, but we're just sort of doing it manually for today, so we see how it works. So we can create this view. Now we could cheat and pick the list template and let Visual Studio write all the code. We're going to do it ourselves because I think it'll give us a little better understanding of what actually is in one of these views. So for the moment, I'll say empty. We'll just call the view albums. So I'll just click add here. I won't change anything. So we need to do a couple things on here. The first thing we need to do, if our controller method is passing in a list of albums, we need a declaration at the top here that says what kind of data is this view going to receive from the controller method. So we do it this way. We declare model our project name, models. So it's similar to this. This would be what we want if we were passing in a single model, one object like on a details or an edit view. But we're not passing in one object here, we're passing in a whole list of objects. So we need to declare that rather than passing in one, we're actually passing a whole list. So what we need here is to use numerable. So this basically means a list of albums. That's what this page is going to expect. It's going to be a list, and that list will be strongly typed. Everything that comes in is of type album. Let me just double check my syntax for a minute. Just go here to index. Yeah, okay, we did it right. I'll ignore that. So now we should be able to use a loop to just output the data. So again, I'll use var. I'm missing something here, but we'll figure it out. Oh, no, sorry. And maybe we'll just wrap this in a list. No, it actually is model. Now, I don't understand why. The declaration here is always lowercase, yet when we're looping through inside here, it's uppercase. I can't tell you why. It makes absolutely no sense to me. All the time in teaching this course, I've yet to find a satisfactory explanation why the declaration is lowercase, but when we're referencing it within the actual view code, we use a capital L. I couldn't tell you. If I put a lowercase in here, I don't think it will work. It doesn't exist. Your guess is as good as mine. So now you notice it recognizes, because we've declared the model for this view is of type album, it shows me any public properties or methods of this object. So we want to display the album title. So this is a huge advantage in building our views as opposed to working with a technology like PHP. When we output properties, we don't get any code hinting as to what those properties actually are because everything's just an untyped object. Same with our ViewBag. We don't get any hints and there's no data typing. So we don't really want to pass information other than basic text information with the ViewBag. We want to typically pass in a strongly typed object, whether it's a list or a single object. So if we save and build here, we could now go to our store albums. And we should have albums 1 through 10, which we do. If I try to access a dot anything else, price doesn't exist. So at runtime, my editor is going to tell me, no, you can't display this field. It's not part of the model. So it's giving me a clue here. I've named something incorrectly or tried to refer to something that doesn't exist. I didn't save my change. So it's going to fail at runtime as well. There's no property called price in this type of object. Again, it's going to make this easier to debug, but I shouldn't even have to load it in my browser. If I'm paying any attention at all to my code editor, I know I'm trying to display something that hasn't been declared, doesn't exist. I'll set it back this way. Whenever we're rendering a list of data, we're going to use this IEnumerable construct and then declare what class, what type of object is that list. If we want to pass in a single object, render a single object on a page, our code's the same. We just don't need the IEnumerable and we don't need the angled brackets. That means our view is expecting one object of a particular type. So again, you can see that here. Here's our index view. It accepts an IEnumerable of type industry. Our details view accepts a single industry object. There's no IEnumerable here because we're only displaying one object at a time. So we're probably not going to keep this page moving forward because instead of, or we may keep the view, but we're going to change this. We're certainly not going to just make up a list of 1 to 10 albums. We want to query the album table in our database and pull whatever data is out of there. I think there's about 250 albums in the database we're going to set up. So we want this list to show whatever's in there. We add a new album to the database, it should automatically go in. It should get displayed on our view. So we're going to be always working, both coming in. So here's data coming from the controller, going to the view. This is going to be the same thing. Back to week 1 for a minute. So when we're selecting data from the model and rendering it, we have strongly typed objects, either as a list or a single. And if data's coming from the view, if we're adding a record or updating, it's going to be the same thing. We're going to pass a strongly typed object to our controller. So our create method or our update method, those aren't just going to be accepting strings, it's going to be accepting an object. And our controller will update the model or add a new instance of our model to our database for creating a new record. So we're always working with strongly typed objects in .NET MVC. Questions? Errors?
In the album, can also pass for the key and value instead of the list.
Sorry, pass it where?
In the return view.
Can we pass keys and values? We can pass keys and values, but we generally want to pass entire objects because then our objects get all of the properties and all of the methods as well of that strongly typed object. So technically it's possible, but we don't generally pass keys and values. We're passing lists of objects for the most part. So possible, yes. If you wanted to, there's a .NET object called a hash table, right? So it's basically like a 2-dimensional array where you could set up keys and values. Yeah, so your import, it has to reflect accurately what you're passing, because that tells the view exactly what's coming in. If you pass something other than what's in the model, So this has got to match what's being passed here, or it'll throw an error. Okay. So let's say I do this. Let's say I just pass it. I'll just create a string x equals ABC. Pass in x. My view is expecting a list of albums, right? An enumerable type album, but all I'm doing is passing a string. So this should give me an error. Okay, actually, that's probably not a good idea. That actually is loaded a view called ABC. But it does. So the model passed is an int, but our view is expecting an enumerable of type album. So this is the error that you'll get if there's a mismatch between what's being passed from the controller and what the model declaration is on the view. So if you ever get this error, and chances are you will, the first thing to do is check, what am I passing? And what's the view, what's the controller passing, and what's the view expecting to get? Even if I took IEnumerable out, we'd get the same error, because it would say the controller's passing a list and the view is expecting a single album. So if you want to pass keys and values, like in a hash table, then yes, your model in the view has to accept a hash table, or you'll get a mismatch error. Any other questions about our code today? Okay, I'm going to push this up to GitHub. So this should be, for the most part, the end of the code for today. So I'll just so everything we've done is on GitHub now if you need to reference it. Mark.
Can you go over ViewBag a little bit more?
Sure. Okay. I have a link that might be helpful. Hang on. Let me see if I can find the link. If not, I will just do a quick search for it. One of these articles has got a nice chart comparing. Bear with me for just a second, because I thought I had the link on Blackboard. I used to. Okay. So think of it this way. ViewBag is like this empty container. It's basically a really simple way if we want to pass some unstructured, untyped data or information from our controller to our view. So there's no typing. It's not a list. We have no access to properties, methods, or events. We typically just use it to pass in messages. So it's just an object that lets us send simple data that's not structured from the controller to the view. So for example, here would be a common, I'll show you a common use. I think I actually have one in this example. I'll try to give you a little context for it. Here, let me go here. A minute. Let's log in. Okay. So I have a little message in blue prompting somebody to log in here. If I put in an invalid credential, so what I'm doing is using the ViewBag for that message. So it's just simple data. When I check the login, I'm checking the login, and if it's invalid, I just set the ViewBag message to invalid login. So in the view, it looks like this. So all I'm doing, when the page first loads, I set the ViewBag message to please log in. If they give me an invalid credential, I set the ViewBag message to invalid login. And I also just dynamically change the class so that it appears in red. Here would be another common time we might use the ViewBag. Let's say we have a search query. So we want to display a list of data that matches the search, but above it, we want to show how many search results there were. So I write a query in my controller that grabs all the data, and then I just want to do a count to get a number to put above it. In fact, I think I did it here in last year's music store. Eventually, we'll actually do this. Look at the method. Here. Okay, let's go here. So I have a store manager controller. Okay. So eventually, in our store manager, users could put in a keyword. So I want to see all the live albums, for example. So here's our query. Go and get all the albums containing the keyword. And then I called the count method. And then I just stuck that value in the ViewBag. In my view, right, we passed in just like we just did. So this view would accept a list of albums. And then I used ViewBag here so I could show above the list, if the user searched, how many albums match their search term. So it's just a very simple generic container to pass simple data from a controller method into the view. I'm still passing in a complex data model, but that count property, I want to show it in the view, but it's not part of my data model. I have no effective way to show how many albums matched. So I just calculated it in the controller and passed it in the ViewBag. Same with the title, the keyword. Okay. So just think of it as a quick and dirty way to pass info from the controller to the view. Does that help at all? Okay. Any other questions? Yep. Okay. Okay. The name's probably not quite right. So here's what to do if the name's not quite right. Here's what I suggest to do. Open the file up in Notepad and just do Control-A, Control-C. Just copy it all, close Notepad. Right-click and delete your Gitignore file. Then open Notepad back up. Paste the content back in. And make sure you save it this way. Click on File and Save As. Call it .gitignore. Here's the key. You need to change this Save As type. Change it to all files. Otherwise, Notepad will save it with the TXT extension, which makes it not work. So now if you click Save, it should work. So click Save and then run your Git commands again, and the Gitignore should work. That's okay. Yep, that's fine. That's because, so in my version of Windows, I have the showing of the file extension on. You may not have that, or you may not have, sorry. Stop this. Okay, try it again. That should solve your problem. It's a bit tricky because Windows doesn't like creating the file with no name. It thinks if there's nothing to the left of the dot, the file has no name. So Windows kind of balks at that. You can't create the file directly in Windows with that name. So Notepad is our little hack and file save as.
Will you be able to add that file while creating a repository?
Yeah, so you could. So there is, when you create a new repository, yes, there is the template. So here's the only thing. So you can do it this way. You can create a repository, and in here, you can choose the Gitignore for Visual Studio. So GitHub does actually have the same template. The only issue is if you do this, before you push, you now need to pull the file down because your local folder doesn't have the Gitignore. So now you've got, I find that gets messy when you make changes on GitHub and changes locally, you often run into problems. So it's easier to generate the Gitignore file that way, but you need to make sure as soon as you initialize, you need to pull that file down before you push. Or you get out of sync, which is kind of troublesome to fix. Okay, so all of today's code is online. So all I'd like to do before we go is just kind of give you the tools and make sure everyone is set up for next week's class to use SQL Server so that we can actually connect and use our database. Oh, and one other thing just before we do that. So, really easy. You have a second lab. It's due Thursday. It's simple. Sorry, this says lab 1. It should say lab 2. We've done lab 1. Make another project, call it lab 2. You don't need unit testing. You don't need authentication. Okay, just use the template. Make sure you have the correct Gitignore. On the template, on the layout file, make sure you put your full name and student number in the layout file. So you got to go into the layout file and modify it. Create a new controller called products and create an index view that shows 3 products: laptop, tablet, desktop. It's basically an exact replica of what we did with our store index today, right? Just hard code those 3 values in. Each one is a link. When you click it, it loads a view called details, passes it in as a parameter. And that details view will show whatever product the user clicked on. Exactly what we did in store. I want you to try it on your own. Okay. Make sure you've got the right Gitignore file. Push to GitHub. It says publish to Azure. Don't worry about that. We'll get into that next week. You don't have to publish to Azure. This will not take long. This should maybe take 10 or 15 minutes. You have 3 days to do it. Okay, it's just submit by 5 on Thursday. I don't care if this one's public or private, particularly either. Any questions about the lab? Yep. Just submit the GitHub link just like you did for lab 1. Okay, so to set up for class next week, you want to make sure SQL Server is installed. You can get it from tools and resources. You may be better off, I put the link here, you may be better off to get it from the Imagine store. And I'm actually going to modify this. Let me go to the Imagine store and get it from here. Get it from here. I'm going to modify the link. I would recommend get the standard version. I didn't realize the developer edition doesn't come bundled with Management Studio, which we're going to want. So you can download and install here's SQL Server 2017 standard. You can accept, when you run the installer, it gives you a whole pile of options. All you need to do is click the link at the very top. The very first option is install a new standalone installation or add to an existing installation. Just click that link and then just accept all the defaults. You don't have to change anything. It'll ask you how you want to do authentication, and that will default to Windows authentication. That's fine. Just click next, next, next all the way through. So download it. Please have that downloaded and installed for next week. So that will install two things. Well, we'll install a bunch of things, but we really only need two. It will install the server itself. And by default, it will run automatically. It's configured to run automatically when you boot to Windows, which is good, which means you don't have to go in and turn the server on and off. If you want to disable it, you can disable it through your Windows services. For this semester, it's probably better you just have it running. That way you just install it and you don't have to touch it, it's automatically on. The other program that it installs is this one, which you'll want to pin to your taskbar or your start menu, which is SQL Server Management Studio. This is Microsoft's version of MySQL Workbench. It's much better, much more powerful. So this is the interface we're going to use to connect to and manage our SQL Server databases. So you'll have a couple of options for your MVC Music Store. I'm going to set it up both on my local SQL Server because it's faster. I will also set it up on my Azure account. You can use either one. For your assignments, you're definitely going to need to create a database on Azure. So we'll also look at how do we create a database in the Azure portal next week, and then how do we connect to it through Management Studio so we can manage, update, query that database. So just make sure you have this stuff installed for next week, please.
So how is this different from XAMPP?
Those are web servers. So all they do is serve web pages on a localhost browser. This is a database server. So this is analogous to MySQL. Okay, this is, so in our PHP class, we had two servers. We had a MySQL server for the database, and then you use XAMPP, WAMP, or MAMP as the web server. In this class, the web server, we didn't need to do a separate install because Visual Studio comes with IIS Express, right? So that's the equivalent of WAMP or XAMPP. It's built into Visual Studio, so we didn't need to install anything separately. But we haven't used the database so far. SQL Server, what you need to download and install. You may want to do it on the college's internet. I think it's 1.5 gigs. Roughly to download. So do it here. Don't use up all your bandwidth at home. Our connection's probably faster here. So this will be the database server. It's faster at home. Fill your boot, and you have unlimited internet. Fill your boots. So for next week, our plan is we'll have a little quiz reviewing controllers and views, okay, like we've talked about this week. So before you roll in here at 3 o'clock. Maybe have a quick look at some of the stuff we talked about this week. So our class average will be better than what it was this time. I'm confident it will be. Then what we're going to do is actually set up our music store database. And again, I'll do it, show you how to set it up locally and set it up on Azure, and you can connect to either one. And then we'll get our web application here, our MVC Music Store, we'll get it talking to the database. We'll look at Entity Framework and how it works, the data access library. And then we're basically going to redo this page. Instead of using our fake 10 albums, we want to query real album data. And then we can start to look at how the whole model view controller architecture works when we have a real database on the back end, instead of just something that we've kind of faked. All right, I will also probably give you assignment 1 next week. So after our quiz, we'll talk about assignment 1. And I'll post that. You have a few weeks to do it. It's not big. Won't take that long. Okay, I have office hours Thursday. I have a bit of time between now and Thursday, if you need to come see me before then, please send me an email because I'm in and out and I've got a bunch of meetings this week. All right. That's all for today. It's free to go.